Hello, this is Mr. Mendez, and the purpose of this screencast is to complete your notes on the Dakota. I'm showing you a Cornell Notes page first because you need to start a new notes page for what you're doing. So flip to your next note page, which of course is on the right side, and you're only going to be writing in this class notes section. Because the topic is still the same, you're still doing Dakota. You can write today's date, which depending on what day you're doing this on, you'd either for Friday make it 9/14 or 9/15 or 9/16, and it's the Dakota. And then you're taking your notes in this area. Later on, together as a class, we'll be doing the need to knows and the summary. So only taking notes in here. Okay, to go through this in hyperspeed, we have already covered a number of things in this presentation. So we talked about origins and the spirit road. We also talked about the 7 big fires, or the 7 council fires. Finally, we talked about Badote and where the Dakota come from. So now we pick up on letter D. So you're going to want to make a letter D on the far left side of your new notes page. That means you're creating a D right here. So if I were writing my D, it would appear up here in the upper left corner. All right, take a look at this map. We know the location of the various bands. I want you to notice that these 4 bands here are all concentrated in the east and still mostly in Minnesota, whereas these 3 bands have really stretched out wide. And you're going to find out that there was some westward expansion, meaning these groups had really spread west for a couple reasons. And so the Dakota Territory covers many states at this time. And this is right around 1700. So roughly 300 years ago is when this occurred. So the Dakota, letter A, were pushed south and west by the arrival of the Ojibwe after 1700. They were also being pushed west by the arrival of whites, mainly French fur trappers. So as those people were coming in from this area, it was pushing the Dakota west because they were in search of resources, places to live, and things to live off of. Letter B, because they are spreading out, you can see how far apart they are, almost covering an entire state, which if you've driven across a state, driving across Minnesota would take several hours, right? So they're pretty far apart. And they didn't have cars. So they developed 3 dialects by 1800. And dialects are different versions of the same language. So they could understand each other, but they sounded very different. Dakota is the first dialect, and it's spoken by the Sisseton, the Wahpeton, the Mdewakanton, and the Wapakut. So it is spoken by these 4 bands. 1, 2, 3, 4. And they're close enough where they're all speaking Dakota. Nakota is spoken by the Yankton and Yanktonai. And that's these 2 bands. So they had enough relationships, probably through trade and bumping into each other, where they maintained a similar dialect called Nakota. Finally, Lakota is spoken by the Teton bands, and they lived in the Dakotas. That's the Teton far out here. And so they spoke Lakota. Letter C. The Dakota languages, or the Dakota language, and these three dialects were written down by Samuel Pond, and he was a missionary. And he did this in 1830, and he created a Dakota to English dictionary so that we know Dakota today and can translate it to English, we being English speakers in the United States. But there are still fluent Dakota speakers, and maybe it's because of what Samuel Pond did. Okay, now we're on letter E. So uppercase E, far left side of your notes. This will go under the letter D, so you're going back out to the side of your notes, and it's family and kinship. And this picture shows a family of Dakota living in a small community, a tribe perhaps. And a lot of their kinship and family rules and ways of living are similar to mainstream America's today, but some are a little bit different. So, the Dakota, A, believe, because they still believe it, and back then believed in being a good relative. So had or have a sense of responsibility for others. It was really strong in the Dakota people, and still is to this day, that you support your relatives, the people you're related to. Letter B, had or have a strong relationships with extended family. So beyond just your relative, your extended family, you have this very strong relationship with them. So strong that children would often have multiple mothers. They would have their birth mother, but they would look to what we would call today aunts and uncles as also mothers and fathers. And this is called tioshpe. And that's that idea of that strong family unit. That's your tioshpe. Those are your people or your relatives. And then lowercase c, the Dakota depended on kinship rules to provide a sense of security and adherence to laws and rules. You didn't break rules within a Dakota community because you were related to everybody. Just like you don't do bad things to the people you're related to, you respect them because they're members of your family. The same existed here, and there were many kinship rules. One kinship rule, which you will find out, is that you always give food or resources to people in need, because everybody that you would run into as a Dakota person was your relative. So that was a kinship rule. And so these family ties is what kept order within the communities and taught people values. Letter F, food sources. And this shows some Dakota hunters hunting bison. This probably would have been done by the bands that lived out on the plains. So the Dakota, lowercase a, depended on hunting, fishing, and the land for food. There were no grocery stores, no markets. They depended on the rhythms of nature and what nature provided for food. Lowercase b, the Dakota women harvested wild rice, water lily roots, and corn for food. So they did grow corn from the ground. But then water lily roots and wild rice grew naturally, and that was harvested by the women. Women often would build scaffolds, which are kind of like a raised platform that raises you up above the ground, around the corn crop to scare birds away. And oftentimes this was a child's job, was to be a living scarecrow. C, lowercase c. Whereas the women harvested wild rice, men hunted bison, deer, 60 in a good year, ducks, geese, elk, bear, muskrats, and smaller game. And they were very skilled hunters. Here are women harvesting wild rice. Here are the people serving as scarecrows. You see the crows flying off, and the scaffold is the platform they're standing on. There's another one in the background. And this is the corn crop. And then here is a man hunting bison, or some type of large game, and obviously after the arrival of the horse. Okay, Letter G, uppercase G, is homes. This goes on the far left, and remember to use your finger to create that shape that we want for outlined notes. So the Dakota, lowercase a, lived in what are called teepees, with wooden poles and animal hides during the winter. And teepees meant something you lived in. So it wasn't necessarily always this shape, but that's how we take it in modern culture, modern mainstream American culture, that that's a teepee, but it means lived in. B is the Dakota lived in bark homes or lodges during spring and summer. So in the winter, they lived in teepees, but then they lived in these more permanent homes that they returned to every year that were made out of bark or wood in the spring and summer. So often in the movies, we'll see Dakota people or people who are supposed to be Dakota only living in teepees. That's not always true. They also lived in bark homes or lodges for half the year. Lowercase c. The Dakota used the same structures year after year. So they would return to these homes, almost like you go, if you do own a cabin up north, people in Minnesota, a lot do, return to the same cabin year after year when the summer rolls around or spring. And then they close it up in the fall. Same concept. Okay, uppercase H, we have a picture of an elder speaking to a group, and this is education, and that elder is probably giving the group of people an education. So the Dakota observed and adapted to the world around them. So whatever nature gave them, if it was a storm, if it was good weather, if it was a lot of bison or few bison, they had to adapt to those conditions. Sometimes conditions were good, sometimes they were bad, but they had existed in Minnesota for thousands of years, so they figured out how to do it very successfully. The Dakota taught and teach by example. So children would observe adults doing things, copy what they're doing, and then practice it. And you'll see with hunting, a boy would practice hunting small game, for example. A girl might practice making clothing on a small doll. The Dakota, lowercase c, expect and expected children to listen, recall, and ask questions about what they had seen or heard. So much like you in Breck School, we expect you to listen and recall and ask questions. Same with Dakota children. After they had watched the adults do something, they were supposed to listen to what the adults said, try to remember what they said, and ask questions if they didn't understand. Letter D, lowercase d. The Dakota taught children to be independent and self-reliant. In other words, children were taught to be able to depend on themselves. And by depending on themselves, which kind of seems strange, they would be able to help the group. Like a young boy who could depend on himself for hunting and catching his own prey, well, he would then be able to help the group by being independent and self-reliant. So nobody was helpless, in other words. Everybody had to depend on everyone, and that's by becoming independent and being able to take care of themselves. They then could help others. It's almost like putting your mask on in an airplane. Parents are asked to put their mask on first before they help children. Everybody in the Dakota tribe or group was able to take care of themselves so they could take care of others. And lowercase e, the Dakota use or use names to inspire the honorable trait of an ancestor in the child. So this is how a child was named. So you wanted to inspire that honorable trait that the ancestor had, you would name the child that. And Ohiesa means the victor. And Ohiesa is a name that we will come across again from a very, very important Dakota person. But it means victor. So if you wanted to celebrate a relative or you wanted to bestow upon a child the honorable trait of being victorious, you would give that child the name Ohiesa. Okay, if you have any questions after this, please make sure you either email Mr. Mendez or write them down to ask Mr. Mendez in class. You can always write the questions in that Q column to the far left, which is for need to knows. You You can also write questions in there. So if you had any confusion, you can ask Mr. Mendez. All right, thank you for listening.